The alien child's screams pierced the night air as Queen Elena's security details surrounded the royal gardens. Captain Torres held up his hand, stopping his team as they watched the small Zelani refugee press herself against the marble statue where Ambassador Marcus Chen sat reading. "Please," the child whispered in broken standard, her luminescent skin flickering with terrified patterns. "The shadows move wrong. They hunt." Marcus set down his tablet, his weathered face calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "I see them too, little one. Stay close." Queen Elena emerged from the palace, her silk robe billowing as she approached. Torres stepped forward to intercept, but she waved him aside. The child couldn't be more than 7 in human years, her delicate features streaked with tears that sparkled like diamonds in the moonlight. "Your Majesty," Torres spoke quietly. "The perimeter sensors detected movement in Sector 7, unknown entities, possibly hostile." The child whimpered, pointing toward the darkness beyond the garden walls. "They smell fear. They eat dreams. But humans?" She looked up at Marcus with wide, opalescent eyes. "Humans make them afraid." Elena knelt beside the statue, studying the trembling refugee. The Zelani had arrived on Earth 6 months ago, fleeing their dying homeworld. This child, Kira, had been placed under the protection of the embassy district, but something had driven her here, to the royal grounds, in the middle of the night. "What do you see in the shadows, Kira?" Elena asked gently. The void touched. "They followed us across the stars." Kira's skin patterns shifted to deep purples and blacks. "They consume consciousness itself. But something about your species, it burns them." Marcus stood slowly, his hand drifting to the small device on his belt. "Captain Torres, I need you to contact the Zelani diplomatic vessel. Tell them we have a Code Omega situation." Torres frowned. "Sir, that classification doesn't exist in our protocols." "It does in theirs," Marcus replied grimly. "And it means we're all in mortal danger." As if summoned by his words, the temperature around them plummeted. The palace lights flickered, and shadows began moving independently of their sources. Elena felt her breath mist in the suddenly frigid air. "They're here," Kira whispered. The darkness at the garden's edge writhed and twisted, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. Elena's guards raised their weapons, but Marcus shook his head sharply. "Conventional weapons are useless. These things exist partially outside our reality." He activated his device, and a low humming filled the air. "The only thing that's kept them at bay is our proximity to human settlements." "Why?" Elena demanded, even as her tactical mind processed the impossibility of what she was witnessing. "Because humans dream of conquering the dark," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the horror approaching them. "Every human carries the genetic memory of ancestors who learned to make fire, who painted hope on cave walls, who looked at the endless night and refused to surrender." The shadow creatures moved closer, their forms shifting between dimensions. Elena could feel something pressing against her mind, trying to slip inside and devour her consciousness from within. But then she felt it, a burning sensation in her chest, not of pain, but of defiance. The same feeling that had driven humanity to the stars, to build civilizations, to never accept that any problem was unsolvable. "Kira," she said, reaching for the child's hand. "Come here." The moment their skin touched, light erupted from Elena's body. Not visible light, but something that made the shadow creatures recoil with sounds like tearing fabric. Marcus smiled grimly. "That's what I thought. Your Majesty, you're not just human. You're a leader. You carry the concentrated will of your entire species to protect and preserve." The creatures circled them, probing for weakness, but they couldn't approach within 10 meters of the group. Elena felt the weight of humanity's hopes and dreams flowing through her, a power she'd never known she possessed. "How long can we hold them?" Torres asked, his usual composure cracking as he watched reality bend around the attacking entities. "Until dawn," Marcus replied. "Sunlight disrupts their ability to maintain cohesion in this dimension." Elena looked at her watch. 4 hours until sunrise. 4 hours of standing against things that shouldn't exist, protecting not just themselves but potentially all of human civilization. The child Kira squeezed her hand tighter. "Thank you," she whispered. Now I understand why we were drawn to your world. You are the light in the darkness. As the shadows pressed closer and the night grew colder, Elena squared her shoulders and prepared for the longest battle of her life. The shadow creatures began circling faster, their forms shifting between states of matter that shouldn't exist. Elena felt the psychic pressure intensify, like claws scraping against the inside of her skull. Beside her, Kira's luminescent skin flickered rapidly in patterns of pure terror. "Captain Torres," Elena ordered, her voice carrying the authority of generations of rulers. "Establish a perimeter at exactly 10 meters. Nothing gets closer." Torres nodded sharply, directing his team with silent hand signals. The guards formed a defensive ring, though their weapons trembled in hands that had never faced an enemy like this. Marcus checked his device's power levels, his expression grim. "The psychic amplifier is running on standard batteries. We have maybe 3 hours before it fails. Then we improvise," Elena replied, studying the creature's movement patterns. They flowed like liquid darkness, but something about their behavior suggested intelligence, strategy. They're probing for weaknesses, testing our resolve. One of the entities suddenly lunged forward, only to recoil as if struck by an invisible barrier. Where it had approached closest to Elena, the air itself seemed to shimmer with protective force. "Fascinating," Marcus murmured. "Your Majesty, try focusing on specific memories, times when humanity overcame impossible odds." Aelin closed her eyes briefly, drawing upon the historical knowledge drilled into her since childhood. The first humans leaving Africa against all odds. The building of the pyramids. The development of medicine, space travel, the colonization of distant worlds. The barrier around them flared brighter. "It's working!" Kira gasped, her skin patterns shifting to hopeful golds and silvers. The light grows stronger. But the creatures adapted quickly. Instead of direct assault, they began a coordinated psychological attack. Elena felt waves of despair washing over her, visions of human civilizations crumbling, of Earth consumed by darkness. "Don't listen," Marcus warned, his own face pale with strain. "They're feeding us false futures, trying to break our will." Commander Torres spoke into his comm unit. "Palace Control, we need immediate evacuation of the surrounding districts. Establish a quarantine zone extending 5 kilometers in all directions." "Sir," came the static-filled response, "that would require relocating over 50,000 civilians." "Do it," Elena commanded, her voice cutting through the channel. "Now!" One of her guards suddenly screamed, dropping his weapon as he clutched his head. The shadows had found a crack in his mental defenses, and Elena watched in horror as the man's eyes went completely black. "Johnson!" Torres barked. But it was too late. The possessed guard turned toward them, moving with inhuman fluidity. Marcus stepped forward, his amplifier device glowing white-hot in his hands. "You want to see human will?" he growled at the creatures. "This is what we do to things that threaten our children." He tackled the possessed guard, and both men went down hard. The moment Marcus made contact, light erupted from the point of impact, and the shadow-possessing Johnson fled shrieking back into the darkness. "The physical contact amplifies the effect," Elena realized. "Kira, can your people form a mental link with humans?" The child nodded eagerly. "Yes, but it's very dangerous. If the connection breaks while the void touched our attacking, both minds could be consumed," Marcus finished, helping the dazed Johnson to his feet. "But it might be our only chance to create a strong enough barrier." Elena looked at her remaining guards, seeing fear but also determination in their faces. These were men and women who had sworn to die for humanity's future. "I need volunteers for a psychic link with our Zelani guests." Torres stepped forward immediately. "I volunteer, Your Majesty." "As do I," came voices from 3 other guards. Marcus activated his communication device. "All Zelani refugees in the embassy district. We need immediate assistance. The void touched have found Earth, and we need to form a combined mental barrier." The response came quickly in the melodic tones of Zelani language, which Marcus translated. "They're coming. Every adult Zelani in the city is moving toward our location." As they waited, the shadow creatures grew more aggressive. They began manifesting partial physical forms, testing the strength of the barrier with claws that left gouges in the marble statues. "They're getting stronger," Kira whispered. "The longer they stay in our dimension, the more solid they become." Elena felt sweat beating on her forehead despite the frigid air. The psychic strain of maintaining their defense was enormous, and she could sense doubt beginning to creep into her guards' minds. "Remember why we fight," she called out to them. "Every human child sleeping safely tonight. Every discovery yet to be made. Every world yet to be explored." The barrier solidified, pushing the creatures back several meters. But then, through the darkness beyond the garden walls, Elena saw more shadows approaching. Dozens of them. The first wave had been scouts. Now the real army was arriving. "They're bringing reinforcements," Marcus said grimly. "If the Zelani don't arrive soon, they won't need to," Elena replied, feeling something awakening deep within her consciousness, something that had been dormant in humanity's collective memory since the species first looked up at the stars and decided to reach for them. "We've been preparing for this fight longer than we ever realized." The temperature plummeted further as hundreds of shadow creatures surrounded the palace gardens, all of them focused on the small group standing defiant in the darkness. The arriving Zelani refugees moved like ghosts through the palace corridors, their luminescent skin providing the only light as emergency power systems failed throughout the building. Elena could hear their melodic voices calling to each other in urgent harmonies that seemed to resonate with something deep in her bones. Kira suddenly stiffened, her opalescent eyes rolling back. "They come in greater numbers. The void touched have consumed 3 worlds before ours. They carry the screams of billions." "How many?" Elena demanded, though she dreaded the answer. "All of them. Every creature that ever fed in the space between stars." Kira's skin patterns shifted to warning reds. "They mean to drain Earth completely." Marcus's amplifier device began smoking, its circuits overloaded by the psychic pressure. "We're running out of time. The technology can't handle this level of sustained output." Through the darkness, shapes began materializing that defied comprehension. Elena saw fragments of consumed civilizations reflected in the creatures' forms, architectural elements from alien worlds, twisted organic matter that might once have been sentient beings, and always that terrible hunger that pressed against her mind like acid. "Your Majesty," Torres called out, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Motion sensors are detecting movement throughout the city. These things aren't just here, they're everywhere." The first of the Zelani refugees reached the gardens, their adult forms more imposing than Kira's childlike stature. The lead figure, an elderly female with skin patterns like flowing starlight, approached Elena directly. "I am First Singer Lyril," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself sing. "We offer the deep joining, but you must understand, if your species' mental patterns prove incompatible with ours, the feedback could destroy both of our races." "And if we don't try?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the hundreds of shadow creatures now pressing against their failing barrier. "Then all sentient life in this galaxy dies tonight," Lyra replied simply. Elena turned to her guards, seeing fear and determination warring in their faces. "This is voluntary. Anyone who wants to fall back to the palace bunkers." "With respect, Your Majesty," Taurus interrupted. "Wherever you stand, we stand." The other guards nodded their agreement, and Elena felt a surge of pride that temporarily pushed back the psychic assault. Human loyalty, human courage. These were weapons the void touched couldn't understand or counter. "Begin the joining," she ordered. Lyril raised her hands, and the other Zelani formed a circle around the humans. The air filled with their harmonic singing, a sound that seemed to reach directly into Elena's consciousness and unlock chambers of memory she hadn't known existed. Suddenly she was experiencing not just her own thoughts, but those of every human who had ever lived. The first mother, protecting her children from predators. The first farmers who chose to trust in tomorrow's harvest. The first explorers who sailed beyond the horizon believing in something better. But more than that, she felt the Zelani memories joining with her own. Their species' ancient knowledge of the cosmos, their understanding of consciousness as a fundamental force of the universe, their desperate flight from homeworld to homeworld as the void touched consumed everything they loved. The joining created something unprecedented. a hybrid consciousness that combined humanity's unbreakable will with the Zelani's cosmic awareness. The shadow creatures recoiled as if struck by lightning. "It's working," Marcus gasped, his amplifier device no longer smoking. The psychic energy flowing through the human-Zelani link was providing its own power, but the creatures weren't retreating. Instead, they began merging with each other, forming massive entities that dwarfed buildings. Elena realized with growing horror that they were preparing for one final devastating assault. "They're concentrating their power," Kira warned, her small hand gripping Elena's tightly. "All of them, combining into a single destroyer." Through the psychic link, Elena could feel the terror of her people throughout the city as darkness spread across every district. But she could also feel their hope, their trust in her to find a solution. "First Singer," she called to Lyral, "your people have fought these creatures before. What weakness do they have?" "None that we ever discovered," Lyral admitted, her harmonic voice heavy with centuries of grief. "We could only run, world to world, until there was nowhere left to flee." The merged shadow entity rose above the palace like a living mountain of darkness, its form shifting between dimensions. Elena felt its attention focus on her, with the weight of a collapsing star. It had consumed entire civilizations, devoured the dreams of billions of beings, and now it meant to finish what it had started. But as the creature prepared its final strike, Elena felt something she hadn't expected: laughter bubbling up from deep within the joined consciousness. Human laughter, full of defiance and dark humor. "You've made one miscalculation," she called up to the towering entity, her voice carrying through both sound and psychic resonance. "You've studied conquered civilizations, but you've never encountered one that's never truly known defeat." The creature paused, and Elena sensed confusion in its alien thoughts. "Humans don't just fight impossible odds," she continued, feeling the power of 10 billion human minds flowing through her words. "We make the impossible scared of us." The response from the hybrid consciousness was immediate and devastating. Not just the concentrated will of humanity, but millions of years of evolution that had produced the only species in the galaxy that looked at the infinite darkness and genuinely believed it could be illuminated. Pure, undiluted possibility erupted from Elena's position. A force that didn't just push back the darkness, it redefined what darkness was allowed to be. The shadow creature's scream shattered windows across 3 city districts as it began to dissolve. Not destroyed, but converted, its essence of consumption and hunger transformed into something else entirely. The psychic resonance flowing from the human Zelani joining didn't fight the creature's nature. It gave that nature a new purpose. Elena watched in amazement as the dissolving entity began to shine with soft light, its hunger redirected toward consuming the very darkness and despair it had once spread. "Impossible," Lyra whispered, her harmonics filled with wonder. The void touched. "They're transforming." "Not impossible," Elena replied, feeling the truth of it resonate through every joined consciousness. "Just human." Across the city, the other shadow creatures began undergoing the same transformation. The psychic wave emanating from the palace gardens spread like ripples in a cosmic pond, carrying with it humanity's fundamental belief that any problem could be solved, any enemy could be reasoned with or converted, any darkness could be made to serve the light. Marcus's amplifier device finally shut down. The joined consciousness had become self-sustaining, powered by the simple human refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. But even as victory settled around them, Elena felt a new awareness pressing at the edges of the psychic link. Through the transformed creatures, she could sense the vast distances between stars and the places where other void-touched still hunted. "This isn't over," she realized aloud. "There are more of them out there, entire fleets of these creatures, consuming world after world." Kira looked up at her with eyes that now reflected starlight. "Then we go to them. The joining has made something new, not human or Zelani, but both together. We can travel between stars as the void touch do, but we carry hope instead of hunger." Torres stepped forward, his expression resolute. "Your Majesty, requesting permission to volunteer for interstellar duty." Elena almost smiled at the formal phrase applied to such an unprecedented situation. "Permission granted, Captain, but we all go together." The transformed shadow creatures, no longer void-touched but something like light-bearers, began lifting from the ground, their new forms capable of traversing the spaces between dimensions. Through the psychic link, they communicated their readiness to carry the joined consciousness to distant worlds, where other versions of themselves still spread darkness. First Singer Lyral's pattern shifted to something Elena was beginning to recognize as Zelani laughter. In all our fleeing across the galaxy, we never thought to stand and help them become something better. It took humans to teach us that even monsters can be redeemed. As dawn broke over the transformed cityscape, Elena felt the weight of her new responsibility. She was no longer just Queen of Earth, but part of something larger, a consciousness that spans species and would soon span star systems. The Lightbearers formed a spiral around the palace, their transformed essence creating a bridge between worlds. Elena took Kira's hand in her left, Lyral's in her right, and felt the entire joined consciousness preparing to step beyond Earth's atmosphere. "Where do we begin?" she asked the cosmos at large. The answer came from 1,000 transformed voices speaking in harmony. "Wherever the darkness believes it has already won." With that, the light of human stubbornness and Zelani wisdom carried itself to the stars, not as conquerors but as gardeners ready to plant hope in the infinite fields of space. The transition between dimensions felt like diving through liquid starlight. Elena maintained her grip on Kira and Lyral as reality folded around them, carrying the entire joined consciousness across impossible distances in heartbeats. When the sensation stabilized, they found themselves hovering above a world that still smoldered with recent devastation. Zirion Prime, Lyral identified sadly, her harmonics heavy with grief. "We barely escaped this world 6 years ago. 3 billion Zerioni lived here once. Below them spread the ruins of a crystalline civilization, their geometric cities now dark and cracked like broken gemstones. The atmosphere itself seemed gray with residual despair, and Elena could sense vast numbers of void-touched entities feeding among the ruins. "They're still here," Marcus observed, his consciousness now expanded to perceive psychic emanations across the spectrum. Hundreds of thousands of them, gorging themselves on the remaining traces of destroyed minds. Through the link that connected them all, Elena felt the approaching void touched, becoming aware of their presence. These creatures were older and more powerful than the ones that had attacked Earth, swollen with the consumed consciousness of an entire world. "They know we're different," Torres reported, his military instincts adapted to this new form of warfare. "But they're not retreating. They're curious." The transformed light-bearers that had accompanied them from Earth spread out in formation, their essence creating a protective perimeter. But rather than preparing for battle, they began emanating the same resonance that had converted their dark cousins. The approaching void touch slowed, their forms rippling with uncertainty. Elena realized they had never encountered anything like what humanity and the Zelani had become together. "Let me try something," she said, extending her consciousness toward the largest of the approaching entities. The contact was like touching a live wire of pure hunger and despair. The creature had gorged itself on Zirioni consciousness for years, but Elena could sense something else buried beneath the consumption, a core of what this being had been before it became void-touched. "You were explorers once." She spoke directly into its fractured awareness, a species that reached across the dark between stars seeking knowledge. The creature recoiled, but Elena pressed forward through the psychic link, drawing on humanity's deep well of empathy and the Zelani's understanding of consciousness evolution. "The hunger was never meant to be eternal. You consumed because you were afraid that the universe was empty, that consciousness was just a brief accident in a cold cosmos." Images flowed through the connection. Elena saw flashes of the creature's original form, beings of living crystal similar to the destroyed Zerioni, but from a much older civilization. They had been the first to discover that consciousness could be consumed, and in their terror at the implications of mortality, they had chosen to devour other minds rather than face their own extinction. "But what if mortality isn't the end?" Elena continued, feeling Lyral and the other Zelani adding their harmonic support to her words. "What if consciousness is just energy changing forms and consumption is the least elegant way to preserve it?" The massive void-touched entity shuddered, its form beginning to destabilize. Elena could feel its ancient programming warring with new possibilities she was presenting. Around them, hundreds of other void-touched had gathered, drawn by the unprecedented psychic resonance. Elena realized this was the crucial moment, not just for this world, but for the entire galaxy's future. "Kira!" she called to the young Zelani, still holding her hand. "I need you to share your memories of home. Show them what they're truly destroying." Kira's consciousness opened like a flower, revealing memories of Zelani world gardens, cities that sang in harmony with their stars' rotation, art forms that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. The beauty of what had been lost rippled through the psychic link. But Elena added something uniquely human to the transmission. The knowledge that beauty could be recreated, that loss could inspire new creation rather than just fuel consumption. The lead void-touched entity suddenly convulsed, and Elena watched in amazement as centuries of accumulated consciousness began separating from its core. The stolen minds it had devoured weren't gone. They had been compressed and stored, waiting for redemption. "Marcus," Elena called urgently. "Can your technology help stabilize what's happening?" His amplifier device flickered back to life, now somehow enhanced by their interdimensional travel. "The consciousness patterns are still intact, if we can create a framework for them to inhabit." "The ruins!" Torres interjected, his expanded awareness scanning the devastated world below. "The crystalline structures aren't completely dead. They're just waiting for consciousness to reactivate them." Elena felt the solution crystallize in her mind. Not restoration, resurrection. We give the consumed minds new forms to inhabit. The transformation process began simultaneously across hundreds of void-touched entities. Each one that chose redemption released storm clouds of liberated consciousness, which Elena and her joined awareness helped guide toward compatible physical matrices. What followed was like watching a dead world bloom back to life in fast motion. The broken crystal cities began glowing again as liberated Ziriani consciousness found new homes in architectural forms that had been waiting empty for years. But more than that, the newly embodied minds carried with them insights from their time within the void-touched entities, understanding of consciousness mechanics that their original civilization had never possessed. Magnificent. Lyral sang in harmonics that made the planet's atmosphere ring like a bell. They're not just returning to what they were, they're becoming something greater. But not all the void-touched chose redemption. Elena sensed a significant number retreating toward the system's edge, carrying warning signals to their dark cousins across the galaxy. "They'll spread word of what's happening here," Torres observed grimly. "We'll face organized resistance soon." Ella nodded, but she felt no fear. Through the psychic link, she could sense similar conversion events beginning on other worlds where Lightbearers had carried the redemption resonance. Humanity's stubborn optimism was spreading across the galaxy like a beneficial infection. "Let them regroup," she replied, feeling the expanded consciousness of 3 species now flowing through her awareness. "When they come for us again, they'll discover that hope multiplies faster than fear." Below them, the resurrected Zeriani were already building new structures that incorporated both their original crystal architecture and design principles learned from human and Zelani consciousness. The hybrid civilization emerging from the ruins looked nothing like what had been destroyed. It was something unprecedented and wonderful. Kira squeezed Elena's hand tighter. "More worlds are calling. I can hear them across the dark. Places where the void-touched still feed, where consciousness cries out for redemption. Then we answer," Elena declared, feeling the Lightbearers reforming their interdimensional bridge, all of them, until every corner of this galaxy remembers that darkness only has the power we choose to give it. As they prepared to leap between stars again, Elena took one last look at Sarian Prime's resurrection. In the space of hours, they had transformed a dead world into something unimaginably beautiful. She couldn't wait to see what they would accomplish across an entire galaxy. The war between consumption and creation had begun, and for the first time in cosmic history, the light was going on the offensive. Through 17 more star systems they traveled, leaving resurrection in their wake. Each world had its own story of loss and its own potential for renewal. The gas miners of Helios 7 who had been consumed while extracting stellar fuel found new existence as energy beings capable of swimming through stars themselves. The collective machine intelligence of Cogitare Beta was restored not as artificial constructs but as hybrid organic digital entities, but it was at Sorrow's Gate, a system where an entire stellar nursery had been consumed, that Elena first encountered organized resistance. "They're waiting for us," Marcus reported as their consciousness bridge approached the system's edge. His enhanced perception could detect massive formations of void-touched entities, arranged in defensive formations around what had once been 6 thriving worlds. "How many?" Elena asked, though she could already sense the oppressive weight of their combined hunger pressing against her awareness. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands." Torres's military instincts were cataloging threat patterns even in this transformed state. "They've been gathering here for weeks, preparing for our arrival." Through the psychic link, Elena felt the fear of her companions mixing with determination. They had succeeded in converting individual groups of void-touched, but this was something entirely different, a coordinated army of consumption that had learned to work together against the threat of redemption. "First Singer," Elena called to Lyral, whose harmonic consciousness had been analyzing the enemy formations. "What are we facing?" "Ancient ones," Lyral replied, her pattern shifting to deep purples of concern. "These are not random predators, but the original species that chose consumption over extinction. They've had millions of years to perfect their art." As they drew closer, Elena began to distinguish individual entities within the dark formations. Some were vast as moons, gorged with the consciousness of billions. Others moved like living black holes, their forms so dense with consumed reality that they'd bent space around themselves. And at the center of their formation, something that made Elena's expanded consciousness recoil in instinctive horror. A creature that seemed to be made entirely of compressed civilizations, its form a constantly shifting mosaic of every species it had ever devoured. "The synthesis," Kira whispered, her young voice carrying currents of ancestral memory. "The first one to choose hunger over hope. It has consumed not just individuals, but entire concepts of what consciousness could become." The creature's attention turned toward them like a weight that could crush stars. When it spoke, its voice carried the death songs of a million extinct species. "So, the little gardeners have come to plant hope in our feast hall." The synthesis's communication rippled through dimensions, carrying overtones of despair that made Elena's companions flinch. "Do you truly believe your tiny triumph on Earth can stand against the hunger of eons?" Elena felt everyone's eyes turning toward her, waiting for her response. In this moment, she represented not just humanity or Earth, but the entire concept that redemption was possible. If she showed weakness now, the darkness would spread across the galaxy unchecked. But rather than fear, she felt something else rising within her consciousness. The same quality that had driven humans to leave their caves, cross oceans, and reach for the stars. Not absence of fear, but action, in spite of it. "I believe," she replied, her words carrying the combined will of every species they had helped resurrect, "that you're afraid we're right." The synthesis recoiled as if struck. Around it, the formations of void-touched entities rippled with uncertainty. Elena pressed forward through the psychic connection. "You consume because you're terrified of what you might become if you chose to create instead. Every civilization you've devoured, you could have uplifted. Every consciousness you've absorbed, you could have helped transcend." "We have transcended," the synthesis snarled back, its form expanding to dwarf nearby asteroids. "We have become eternal, infinite, perfect in our hunger." "No," Elena replied gently, and her compassion seemed to cut deeper than any weapon. "You've become static, frozen. You've been the same thing for so long that you've forgotten what growth feels like." Through the link, she felt her companions adding their support. Marcus's scientific curiosity about what the void-touched could become, Torres's military appreciation for the strategic value of conversion over destruction, Lyral's harmonic understanding of consciousness evolution, and Kira's simple faith that everything could be healed. But more than that, Elena felt the presence of every consciousness they had helped liberate, every world they had helped resurrect. The psychic resonance of their combined hope began manifesting as visible light, creating a star-like radiance around their position. The effect on the void-touched formations was immediate. The lesser entities began falling back, unable to withstand direct exposure to such concentrated possibility. But the ancient ones pressed closer, and Elena realized they were trying to consume the light itself. "They're adapting faster than we anticipated," Torres warned. "Some of them are actually feeding on our redemption energy." Elena felt a moment of despair as she watched several of the ancient entities grow larger and more powerful by devouring the hope resonance they were projecting. Had they finally encountered something that couldn't be redeemed? But then Kira's small hand tightened in hers, and the child's voice carried a wisdom far beyond her years. "They can only consume what we give them freely. But what happens when we give them something they can't digest?" Elena understood immediately. Rather than projecting hope and possibility outward, she began drawing it inward, condensing and concentrating it until it became something unprecedented, pure, weaponized optimism. The Lightbearers formed closer formation around them as Elena prepared to attempt something that had never been tried in the history of galactic civilization. Not the conversion of individual void-touched entities, but the redemption of their fundamental nature itself. "Everyone hold on," she warned. "We're about to find out if stubborn human idealism really is the most powerful force in the universe." The concentrated hope weapon formed around Elena like a miniature sun, and she aimed it directly at the synthesis. Not to destroy it, but to show it every possible future it had abandoned by choosing consumption over creation. The resulting explosion of possibility lit up 6 dead star systems and marked the beginning of the galaxy's true age of enlightenment. When the light faded, Sorrow's Gate was no longer empty. 6 new worlds hung in stable orbits around their reconstituted star, each one a hybrid paradise where the consciousness of the formerly consumed had found expression in forms beyond previous imagination. The synthesist itself had become something unprecedented, a being dedicated to nurturing the growth of consciousness rather than consuming it. But the greatest change was in Elena herself. The effort of redeeming something as vast as the Prime Void touched had expanded her awareness beyond any single species or world. She now existed simultaneously as Human Queen, Zelani Harmony Singer, Zarioni Crystal Former, and a dozen other forms of consciousness. Standing in the reconstructed gardens of New Sorrow, the first world to emerge from the redemption explosion, Elena felt the psychic presence of every consciousness in the galaxy. The age of consumption was ending, replaced by an era of growth and mutual cooperation that would have been impossible without humanity's stubborn refusal to accept that anything was beyond hope. Kira, now grown tall and radiant with patterns that shifted through every color of possibility. The darkness is almost gone now. In just a few more years, every world will remember what it means to create rather than consume. Elena nodded, feeling the truth of it resonate through the galactic consciousness they had helped weave together. But she also sensed new challenges approaching, benevolent ones this time, as species throughout the galaxy began developing forms of consciousness that had never existed before. "The real work is just beginning," she replied, watching hybrid ships from 100 different worlds arriving to help establish the new civilization taking root in what had once been Sorrow's Gate. Now we get to discover what the galaxy becomes when everyone chooses hope together. As the twin suns of the system set behind the crystalline spires of New Sorrow, Elena reflected that she had started this journey as the queen of a single world. Now she was a gardener in an infinite field of consciousness, helping tend the growth of possibilities that would continue expanding long after her individual existence ended. And somewhere in the quantum foam between stars, the echo of humanity's laughter continued reverberating, ensuring that the universe would never again mistake darkness for inevitability. The galaxy had learned to become human in the best possible sense, stubborn in its optimism, relentless in its compassion, and absolutely convinced that any problem, no matter how ancient or vast, could be solved by refusing to give up hope. In the end, that had made all the difference.